Alrighty, hello everyone. This is going to be a fabulous day because today the great and legendary Richard Carrier has decided to do an interview with me. How's it going, Richard?
It's
Alrighty,
going all right.
so I'm Edward Tamesian. I'm one of the 5 board of directors of Internet Infidels. I'm also on their kiosk editorial review committee, and I'm a library author as well. And I'm here with John McDonald, who is our vice president for Internet Infidels. He's on the board of directors too, and he's on the kiosk editorial review committee as well. And I'm going to give a brief biography to Richard Carrier, just in case for all of you who do know and don't know him. Alrighty, Richard Carrier is a world-renowned author and speaker. As a professional historian, published philosopher, and prominent defender of the American free thought movement, Dr. Carrier has appeared across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and on American television and London radio, defending sound historical methods and the ethical worldview of secular naturalism. His books and articles have received international attention. With a PhD from Columbia University in ancient history, he specializes in the intellectual history of Greece and Rome, particularly ancient philosophy, religion, and science, with emphasis on the origins of Christianity and the use and progress of science under the Roman Empire. He is also a published expert in the modern philosophy of naturalism as a worldview. He is the author of On the Historicity of Jesus, Proving History, Sense and Goodness Without God, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, Not the Impossible Faith, Why I'm Not a Christian, Jesus from Outer Space, and Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which, by the way, is the best book title of all time. He is also a contributor to The Empty Tomb, The Christian Delusion, The End of Christianity, Christianity is Not Great, and Resurrection, Faith or Fact, as well as copious other work in history and philosophy, online and in print. He is currently working on several projects, from consulting on the Christus app for iOS and Android to teaching affordable online courses in secular philosophy, history, and methodology, and all that can be found on richardcarrier.info. And like I said, sir, at the end, I'll give you time to promote your book and talk about the good old times with Internet Infidels.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. Yep. But before we proceed into the questions, do you have anything quickly you want to add, sir?
No, I mean, especially if we're going to get to my history with you guys. I used to be the editor-in-chief. That's not in that biography, but that was a long time ago, back when Secular Web was really at the forefront of all of this. I'm glad to see you guys are revamping and.
Oh yeah, we are, and you're still listed on the advisory board, by the way.
Happily.
Brett Lamoni's still on there too. Yeah, we gotta update it, but yeah, we've done quite a good job doing things. Alrighty, so for our first question, can you talk a bit about your conversion to Taoism and why you eventually came to atheism?
Yeah, right. So teenage years, high school, right? Everybody's a seeker, doesn't know what's true or whatever. So I was in that state, like I didn't know, like I needed guidance. And so I was in a bookstore and I was feeling like really like sending out thoughts to the universe kind of thing. Like what direction should I take in my life? What is true?
Uh-huh.
And I felt this urge to turn and look, kind of like St. Augustine, right? Like he heard the child's voice says, "Open and read," and he picks a random passage from the Bible and it speaks right to him, and he's converted to Jesus. And for me, it was Taoism, right? So I had this feeling, and I turned around, and the first book I saw was the Tao Te Ching, and I pulled it up, flipped to a random verse, and it spoke exactly to my situation. I don't remember what verse it was now, because it's so long ago.
Yeah.
But it was like it hit me, and it's like, this has to be a miracle, right? Like what the Tao is clearly like looking for me and seeking to guide me and stuff. So I became a convert to Taoism, philosophical Taoism. Of course, I didn't buy into the polytheism or the magic or any of that. But was super huge devotee of the Tao Te Ching and of serious meditation. Like I actually was achieving altered states of consciousness through meditation.
So you were really into this. It wasn't just superficial. You just took your
Oh, no,
gloves.
for sure. Yeah. And I even got to the point where I could get into a meditative state almost anywhere in any condition, like sitting in the passenger seat of a car or in the middle of a firefight. So like there was one occasion when I was hardcore into paintballing back then. That was it was a different world back then. But yeah, I was very much into doing paintball combat scenarios. And I was in the middle of a firefight with paintballs, aka bullets flying everywhere, and I actually was able to get into a meditative state and had like serious revelations, insights occurred to me in that moment. So I've had a lot of those kinds of experiences, including like real religious experiences. There was the one I talk about this for people who are interested. in my book Sense and Goodness Without God. The first couple chapters I go into my whole religious background, and I have a section on the Taoism experience. But in the Coast Guard, so later after high school, when I went to the Coast Guard, Taoism was my declared religion. So when I went to boot camp, you're allowed one devotional item.
Oh.
And so I hand scribed my own Tao Te Ching using like 6 different translations, picked my favorite translation of every verse, and created my own Tao Te Ching. And that was my one devotional item I took with me into boot camp. And so in the Coast Guard, I was still a hardcore Taoist, and had, I lived on a ship for a year, serving at sea, and there were a lot of like 36-hour days and craziness, because you're on multiple shifts, you're on multiple emergency duties, so like you can get in a situation where you don't get to sleep for a really long time. And so I would get into these, when you get into these meditative states after 36 hours of sleep deprivation, you hallucinate, right? So at the time I was seeing this as I was merging my mind with the universe through the Tao, right? Like I saw it as a spiritual experience, and I was able to like expand my mind to see all the living worlds in the universe. It was like literally I could see the whole cosmos, and it's the most wild out of body experience ever. Now, at the same time, I was continuing to do my studies in sciences. I was always a science geek. So in high school, all my electives were science courses. And so I kept reading in science, and I kept reading in Confucianism. So like these are 2 competing philosophies in China. The Taoism is almost kind of a reaction against Confucianism, and they sort of argue against each other. And I was starting to realize that there were things in the Taoist scriptures that I disagreed with. Like I sided more with the Confucians on some things, and I sided more with the Taoists on some things. And then with the science, I started to realize, well, I'm just hallucinating. Like this is sleep deprivation hallucination. This isn't like, and all of the religious experiences had natural explanations, right? So it's realizing like, this isn't actually true. Like I've just been kind of buying into this. And so, but I still valued the philosophy, and even insofar as I was, the dialectic between the 2 philosophies at that point. But that's, in the moment I was like, well, then what is true? And so what I started doing, I started thinking about like how I would build out my own philosophy from scratch. And I actually started my book at that time, Sense and Goodness Without God. I went through many iterations, many changes and evolutions over the next, 10, 15 years. But at that time, and now at this moment of like, I don't know what's true. Again, I was on a Navy base doing firefighter training for torpedo fuel firefighter training. And that's on the Coast Guard. I was duty gunner's mate, sonar tech, sonar operator, torpedo man, and flight deck firefighter. So those were all my duties on the ship, and also ordnance. So I could mount torpedo ordnance onto helicopters.
Okay,
one of the things I trained for. Anyway, so one of these things I was training in San Diego, and and as happens in the military, a sailor comes up to me and says, "Have you found Jesus?" There's always evangelism on military bases, and we got into that conversation. I was like, well, actually, at this time I was still nominally Taoist. So I said, well, I kind of believe in the Tao, and the Tao actually governs all things, including any gods or anything. So even Jesus is subordinate to the Tao. So actually, I'm covered, right? Like I'm talking to a higher power than your guy. And he says, well, but he didn't have a response to that. So his comeback was to go back on script, right? And if you've dealt with evangelists, missionaries, they always find these common scripts. And one of them was, have you read the Bible? And I said, well, I read bits of it. He said, but you haven't read the whole thing. I said, no. So, well, how can you decide if you haven't read the whole Bible? And I said, well, that's a good point. And he says, if I give you the student Bible, will you promise to read the whole thing? I said, yes, I'll read it cover to cover. And so he gave me a Bible. And then so over the next couple of weeks, I just read this. This is all I was doing, was reading the Bible cover to cover from Old Testament.
Oh, from the Old Testament
to New, yeah. Yeah, skipped over the begats, just skimmed the begats, but you know what I mean. But no, yeah, I read the whole thing, and then when I turned the last page of Book of Revelation and finished that out, and I was alone in the barracks, but I spoke out loud and I said, "Yep, I'm an atheist," and that was the moment, I decided, well, I can't be the first person to have discovered this. Now, this is, mind you, this is the early '90s, so it was before atheism was a big breakout thing. It was really hard to find. I mean, the secular web didn't even exist yet, and it was really hard to find atheist literature, like super hard. And I went looking. There's got to be other books, and I just couldn't find any. Eventually, I went to like a used bookstore into the like obscure philosophy section, and then I found Corliss Lamont's book on humanism. I found H.A. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic. I found some Hume. And of course Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, right? So, so I finally started reading in these classics of atheism, and then I was still in the Coast Guard, near the end of my my time in, but I was out in the San Francisco um, uh, Castro Street Fair, and I don't know if you know anything about the Castro Street Fair, and it's very LGBTQ, right? Like it's hardcore, in your face.
There you go.
Everybody's gay, right? So like, and so I'm loving it. I'm having a good time there. And my friend, who's kind of Christian, he's like liberal Christian. There was a booth there that was from American Atheists, and he said, "Hey, look, American Atheists, that's you." I said, "That is me." And so I went up and I discovered the American Atheist Organization. Through them, eventually, I discovered Freedom from Religion Foundation, and so then I got more and more involved. Started publishing. That's when Jeff Lauder got in touch with me and wanted to publish some of my stuff on Secular Web, and then he asked me to start doing a feedback editor for the Secular Web, and everybody was pleased with my snarky handling of that. That eventually they needed an editor in chief, and I was willing to step in at the time. So I was going to board meetings and stuff for running Secular Web way back. This is long ago, but. Yeah, and so I was a part of the growth early years of Secular Web, and that led to my more and more activism, and then into atheism and more intellectual engagement. It led to developing my book Sense and Goodness Without God, which was much more informed by the time that I published because I'd read so much by then, and so that's basically my legacy of how I ended up where I am today.
Sweet. Were you there when they had the Infidel of the Month?
I can't remember. I don't think so.
Yeah, it was like way back in the day when Brett Lamone was still active in the organization. I was reading that. I thought that was like a cool concept. Yeah, that was way back in the day. Alrighty, well, thank you for that, sir. So moving on to our next question. Can you tell us just at least a little bit about the ascension of Isaiah? Because I read Jesus from Outer Space, and you made a reference to it, and I thought it was interesting. So I think everyone, might like to know a little bit about it as well.
For people who want to know, it's my latest book.
I read it, guys. It's good. It's good.
Yeah, it's a nice short read. It's written for a popular market. The academic monograph, which is huge, is on the historicity of Jesus, and it's good to start with Jesus from Outer Space. But if you really want to engage with the scholarship, obviously you'll have to get into the academic one. But I think the short book really gives a good précis of why my doubting the historicity of Jesus makes sense, and it's based on an expert review of the evidence, not some internet amateur stuff that we often encounter. But for people who don't know, that's one text that's kind of I actually don't weigh it very strongly as evidence, but it is a proof of concept, which is that there was this book called The Ascension of Isaiah. Now, we don't have the original. We have edited versions that had material taken out and material put in and stuff like that by later Christians. But by looking at the different versions, we can reconstruct most of the earliest edition that all the others are based on. And when you reconstruct that version, in that version, Jesus only goes as far as the firmament and is crucified by Satan and his demons. He doesn't go all the way to earth, which is kind of a proof of concept of what's called the Doherty thesis, which is this idea that Jesus originally began as a revelatory being. You only found out about him. It's like Angel Moroni. You only found out about him through revelations. And he related that this cosmic drama had undergone, where he had gone down and been crucified by Satan, fooled Satan into killing him, and then gained power over the universe. And we have other religions that followed a similar model. Like Osiris cult had the same thing. Osiris cult had, the public stories made Osiris a historical pharaoh and told the story of his life and adventures on Earth. But the secret teaching was that, no, he was never a historical pharaoh. He was always a cosmic being. And every year he comes down, assumes a mortal body, and is killed by Satan, the equivalent of Satan in the Egyptian religion, up in the lower heavens, like below the orbit of the moon, right? And then he resurrects into a new body and ascends, and that's how he gains power over death. In the Osiris system, it's every year this happens, right? In the Christian system, they adopt the Jewish linear history model, where it happens just one time, and it creates a complete divide between past history and future history. But it's still the same. I'm thinking it's the same model. I think that's how Christianity began. And just like with Osiris cult, when they created biographies putting him in Earth history, later Christians did the same thing. They created the Gospels to put Jesus in Earth history, to allegorize and teach the gospel. Originally, that's how. And then eventually you had these sects started to become more and more insistent that the historical earthly Jesus is the real one, in their sectarian battles against each other. And that's the church that acquired power later, and thus could decide which books we get to read and which books we don't, essentially. So that's my model of what I think actually happened, and for the reasons why and all of that are all covered, like you said, in Jesus from Outer Space is a good summary of why I think that this is the more likely explanation of what happened. And anyway, so that you asked about the ascension of Isaiah, and that's how that features in there. It's just kind of like it shows an example of what could have happened.
Sweet. Yeah, and guys, it's not too long of a book, so y'all should read it. Finished it in about a week.
All right. It's like 200 pages or something. It's not a tough one. Yeah.
Yep.
And no footnotes.
And then on the historicity of Jesus, that one's like the really long one. That's like 700 something pages or something.
Yeah. Compare the size. Ooh. So
that's like NT Wright big, man. It's like
right. Very much is like
this 1,000-page things.
Almost 700 pages. 90 pages is just apparatus, right? Several indexes, bibliography, all of that stuff. So
how many years did that
take? That's a hardcore academic. Oh, that took 6 years. So that was a fan-funded PhD postdoc grant. So after I got my PhD, basically did a postdoc study funded by my fans to look into historicity, and it took 6 years. It resulted in technically 3 books because Proving History came out first on methodology. Because if you take a project like that, the first thing you got to do is method. And so I thoroughly researched what methodology should we apply and not apply and so on. And then I did the actual conclusion applying the method. But in the process, I also published some papers in peer review journals, right? So that were related to this. I did a paper on Tacitus, a paper on Thallus, a paper on Josephus. And so I wanted to get those to be available. And I don't know if you know, in academics, you don't get paid for those. Like basically the journals make tons of money off of your work and you don't see a dime because they charge like $30 for just a PDF of one article. It's kind of outrageous. But almost all their contracts say that you can publish yourself the paper in an anthology of your own works. So I created an anthology of my own works that I sell for $20, and it gets you all of the articles plus tons more of stuff. My old magazine articles are in there. So like the stuff I did for Skeptical Inquirer, some other peer-reviewed works I did on other subjects. So that's Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ that you were just talking about.
There you go.
And the reason it's that title is there are chapters in there on Hitler and on Homer, on the Bible, and on Christ. So and it's kind of a play on Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy.
Okay, nice.
A joke on that. But anyway, that's the story of that book. And so that was the third book. Then they all came out, within 2 years of each other at the end of my postdoc study. So 6 years produced 3 books essentially.
And on the historicity of Jesus was the very first book in history to be on the non-existence of Jesus, and it was peer reviewed.
First in history, the first in the last 100 years, right? So there were some peer-reviewed works. Now, mind you, in the early 20th century, we're talking like early 1900s, our methodologies were not that great. So anything before 1950 is not up to the same standard as post 1950. But nonetheless, there was a peer review process. It just wasn't at the quality that it is now. Even now, it's not like flawless, but its standards now are much higher than they were back then. But there was peer-reviewed work on this. A lot of German scholars, some American scholars published on this. And then there was a response book under peer review as well, I think published by Yale, by Shirley Jackson Case, that was rebutting all of this peer-reviewed work and sort of trying to defend the historicity of Jesus. And that was 1923. In fact, it was earlier than that, but 1923, I think, was the last edition or whatever. But so that's the last peer-reviewed book defending historicity explicitly, and there hasn't been one since. There have been books that assume historicity or like spend a few pages arguing for it, but there's not been a book solely devoted to defending the historicity of Jesus published under peer review in almost 100 years, and nor against. So even mythicism, there was nothing after that was published under peer review. A lot of amateur stuff got published, but no, mine was in 2014 was the first peer-reviewed mythicist book published in almost 100 years. There were a few books where mythicism is proposed as a possibility, but it wasn't specifically what was being argued for. there are a few peer-reviewed books of different kinds that did that, but none of them were devoted to actually trying to argue the thesis. And mine was the first to do that and to meet the standards of the field. And these are the post-1950 standards, which are higher. And then since then, Raphael Lataster has published his book with Brill, which is a highly prestigious academic press, concurring. So basically, we have two peer-reviewed studies now, arguing that the historicity of Jesus is doubtable. And we have no peer-reviewed books taking the opposite position. The opposite position is generally just an assumption or a sort of a apologetic assertion. The ways it's being defended are kind of ridiculous and a little bit suspicious. Like there should be better defenses of the historicity of Jesus by now. Anyway, that's the story of where we are on that. But yeah, it's not the first in history, but it's the first in a long time, almost 100 years.
Awesome. Alrighty, so going on to our other questions. If it is not a historical biography, what was Mark's gospel trying to do?
Right, yeah. So it's the same thing that the Osiris Gospels were trying to do, right? And as Plutarch is the one who tells us about this, is they were meant to be symbolic allegories and to preserve the truth for insiders. You have to join the cult, basically, to be given the secret truth about all this. I think the same thing. And Mark has Jesus say this, right? In Mark chapter 4, he has Jesus, teaching in parables. And then the disciples ask him, what are these parables? Like, what are you talking about? And then Jesus takes them aside in secret and he says, well, like to them, I'm teaching everything in parables so that they won't understand the truth and therefore be saved, which is a really weird thing to say, right? Like, it's like, why are you preaching but training?
You want everyone to be saved? Yeah.
Right. But he says, to you, the insiders, I will tell you the secret meaning of them. And the secret meaning was not the literal meaning. It's like, no, these aren't like real people I'm telling you stories about. The stories are allegories for deeper truths, right? And so that you're supposed to get the point of the story. And so anyway, that by Mark having Jesus explain that, he's actually setting the key to understanding his whole gospel. His whole gospel is doing the same thing. It is, as John Dominic Crossan argues in The Power of Parable, which is a really good book I recommend, Mark is writing an extended parable about Jesus. So Jesus is just the main character of the parable. It's not meant to be history, but outsiders can take it as history. That's fine because they're outsiders and they have to become insiders before they're told like what all of this stuff really means. Like, what's the point of these stories? What do they communicate? And a lot of mythology was written like that. So back then, so this is actually a normal mode. Like the Osiris cult is, again, an example of this. It's a normal mode of doing things. So that's what Mark, I think, was originally doing, because he says that's what he's doing. And he never really says anything to the contrary. As we get later Gospels, we start to see them become more and more pushed more and more as history, right? So Matthew tries to make the Gospel look like a book of the Old Testament. He tries to make it look like Deuteronomy, essentially. And so he has things that are history referencing, like, and this happened to fulfill prophecy, right? Which is kind of like, does he mean that literally, or is that code, or is he hiding is he still doing allegory, or is he trying to push history? He's still not explicit, right? So you're in the iffy land. It could be both. And we have later authors like Origen who actually endorse the simultaneous model. It's called the theory of double truth, where it's like you can push it as literal for the general masses to save them. It will save them with the literal truth, while the educated can understand that it's not literal, that it's the abstract truth, and they can be saved too. So you have these two levels of argumentation, and that was Origen's model. And so Matthew could have been doing the same thing. We're not sure. By the time you get to Luke is actually specifically dressing his book up to look like a history. Like he's emulating a lot of the features of histories. And so he could be doing the same thing, but he is definitely trying to at least convince outsiders that this is historically true. And more explicitly even than Mark is, right? And by the time we get to John, now John actually says all this stuff happened and you should believe it because it happened. Like he's explicitly historicist. So and that's by the way, I should point out, that's the final redactor of John, because John went through multiple authors. Our version of John has been through many edits, so it's not the original version. But the final edition is pro-historicity. It is getting rid of this. No, forget this allegory secret stuff. No, this stuff really happened, and you better believe it because it happened, right? Like that's by the time you get to John, now you've had the full evolution into the historicity model of Christianity.
Sweet. Alrighty, and excellent timing, because our next question is, can you give us some reasons why you do not consider the longer ending of Mark as a part of the original Mark? We're talking Mark 16, 9 through 20. And before you say anything, I just want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, that Bruce Metzger, who was a famous textual critic, Daniel Wallace, Mike Winger, who has a YouTube channel, and James White of Alpha Omega Ministries, they're big Christian scholars, and they all doubt the historicity of Mark. So it's not just liberal
The
Christians
long ending, yeah,
yeah.
right.
So give us your reasons, Carrier.
It's worth pointing out also, Metzger was one of the chief instructors, the mentors of Bart Ehrman. So Bart Ehrman actually studied under Metzger. Metzger was like the greatest textual critic of the 20th century.
Yeah.
A lot of like key literature was written by him or edited by him. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons, and for people who are interested, I have a complete, thorough treatment of this in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. There's a whole chapter in the long ending. I address all the apologetic attempts to defend the historicity of it, or I should say the authenticity of it, and then I also cite all the literature that argue and summarize all the literature that argues against. There's multiple reasons. One is it's stylistically completely different. I mean, the style of the author who wrote that ending is so radically deviant from the style of the rest of the gospel that it's even despite being so few verses. Normally you can't tell, that's too few verses to tell a stylistic difference, but this author is so different as an author that it's just blatantly obvious, even in so short a few verses. And I go into the details of how we know that and how you break that down. There's other aspects. It contradicts the gospel, and it looks like very consciously a summary of the other gospels. So it looks like someone was unsatisfied with the Markan ending and then wrote basically a summary that would just pull pieces out of the other three gospels in the canon. Now that means that whoever wrote it already knew Matthew, Luke, and John, right? So there's already the fourfold gospel already exists at this point, which is long after Mark wrote. So that's one other example of how we know whoever wrote this is writing after the fact. There's other clues and manuscript evidence and authors who talk about what's in the manuscripts. They're actual ancient Christians who discuss what they see in their manuscripts and stuff. So we have, and marginal notes. There's a lot of different interesting evidence that you can put together to do this. And you mentioned a lot of even hardcore Christian scholars. There are a lot of them who admit this. So they say, yeah, okay, you're right. It's not original. And one of the examples, and I talk about this in my chapter in Hitler Homer, is I think it was the Pentecostals. So it was one of these really hardcore denominations. They got these two scholars in their faith. So these are Pentecostals, and had them do a study. Like, can you give us a report? What should we believe about this? And of course Pentecostals need this verse to be true. These verses to be true because it has the snake handling passage in it, right? So it's actually doctrinally important to them. So you think this is the most biased research team that you could possibly have, and they go in and they go through all the evidence. In the end, they say like, well, we have to admit someone else wrote it and stuck it in later. But of course, they still have to defend their dogma. So they have a little twist at the end where they say, yeah, we have to admit it's a forgery, but the forgery was inspired. Right, so
the forgery was inspired.
Correct. You can still treat it as scripture because the forgery was inspired by God. That's but at least they're being honest and saying theological reason rather than a bogus historical one. But so even they had to admit that it wasn't original.
I remember you saying that on like another interview I was watching. I was like, oh my God. And I think like even Bruce Metzger was like, well, the edition that was later added by the author who wasn't Mark was inspired, but he like put it in like 150 AD and was like, whatever. I mean, that's like impossible to prove, but oh well.
Oh, sure, yeah. The dating it is more challenging. It could be anywhere from 150 to 250. I think it starts to be known in the 200s. That's the earliest we hear of it or have any evidence of it. But
hey, Ed, do you mind if I chime in for a second? I just have I wanted
to.
Go ahead, sir. Yep.
It's really exciting to be with you, Dr. Carrier. I've been following your stuff for years. It's pretty impressive.
Cool. Cool.
What I wanted to ask, if I could just pick your brain a little bit, the meaning of the cross, what the original Christians thought was the meaning of the cross, if there was one original vision or stuff like that.
Right.
And so one avenue that people tend to go at is the penal substitution model of the cross. It's a relative latecomer on the scene. It didn't really come until about 1,000 years after Jesus, but and there were previous models such as the ransom model. But I was wondering maybe if you could talk a bit about that, because at first glance, penal substitution seems to be unethical. Just as we would ask, just as we would ask, how is justice served by punishing an innocent child in Africa for a robbery committed by a man in Texas? And it's also a little perplexing from a Jewish context because most Jews would say that the Messiah doesn't need to die because God can just forgive. So,
Right.
and if you take like the penitential Psalms or the story of Jonah, I mean, God is a God who can forgive. So, can you talk a little bit about penal substitution and how it fits into your model of the mythical view of Jesus being crucified in outer space?
Yeah, so well, first of all, that's not, I don't study the later doctrines. So my focus is on the origins of Christianity. So I
Yeah.
can talk about what was really going on. It's much weirder, the original intended meaning of all of this. But for people who are interested in that, there's a book called edited by John Loftus called The End of Christianity. And there's a chapter in it by Ken Pulliam, Dr. Ken Pulliam, called The Absurdity of the Atonement. And he actually goes through all the apologetic examples of well, including penal substitution. There have been many other like models for how to make this make sense. None of them make sense, but they try. So that's actually the best chapter I've ever read, with a good bibliography for people who want to go dive into what are all the different ways Christians try to make sense of this. How does the penal substitution model work, and so on. No, it's weirder. So when you get all the way back to like Paul, for example, so you have to understand the context, the Jewish context. Now, this is all magic. This is magic and cosmology. This is like deep stuff to them, right? And to their view. So there's the famous scene where in the Old Testament where God says, you got to kill your son to Abraham, right? And Abraham's going to kill his son. And God says, actually, I'm going to stop you and say, I'm going to let you substitute an animal. So the animal will substitute for your son and for your firstborn son, and that will accomplish the same effect. And now that story doesn't really go into what the point of any of that was, other than proving the faith of Abraham. But why would doing a substitutionary sacrifice prove his faith in it? It's kind of mysterious. But in later Jewish tradition, this was regarded as the first Yom Kippur. This is the etiological myth for the origin of the Yom Kippur ceremony. Now, in the temple cult, there was the Yom Kippur. This is covered in Leviticus, where Leviticus 16 talks about this, where all of the sacrifices that go there, like you sin, you have to go like wring the neck of a dove or whatever, right? So you have to go like kill an animal to like cleanse yourself of sin. And it's like sin becomes like this magical curse upon you, and you have to basically assuage the anger of God by killing an animal, and that pleases him in some fashion, right? So it's actually kind of very, very much like a primitive shamanic concept of the way the world works. It doesn't make any sense in modern cosmology or justice theory today. But back then, no, God would be angry, and if you did this sacrifice, it would assuage his anger, and then it would cleanse you of this taint, the poison of whatever magical substances get in you when you sin. So it would cleanse you of this. And then, but they figured like, well, people aren't going to be fastidious. They're not going to catch every sin and do all this fastidiously. So every year there's the Yom Kippur where they take the two goats that have to look identical, and one of them, there's a priest casts a spell that casts all the sins of all the Israelites into one of the goats. So they like all the magic, all the evil spirits and everything goes into that goat. And then the other goat, who's pure and innocent, gets slain, and its blood satisfies God and assuages his anger, right? So that blood cleanses Israel of all of these sins. So that's kind of like the catch-all. Every year you can cleanse. Now, as soon as that happens, people start accumulating sin juice after that again, and then they have to keep doing this every year to like reset, hit the reset every year with this thing. And this is actually magic. This is spell casting. This is the kind of that there's spiritual forces and powers and substances that you have to govern and control. There are not evil, but angry gods that you have to assuage. Like this is very primitive thinking. Now, so the idea, this is the context, right? So the Christianity came out of an anti-temple cult. They had a lot of reasons why they were very bothered by the corruption of the temple cult, and we're trying to find these various subsects, these fringe sects, like the Qumran sect, as an example. We're trying to find ways to replace the temple, like some way to still realize God's will, but bypass the corruption of the temple. And one of the ways the Christians figure this out is, well, what if we go back and reverse the reversal? So let's go back to Abraham. And so the goat is supposed to substitute for the son, but goat has less magical mojo, right? That's why I have to repeat it every year. It's the spell isn't strong enough. But what if we were to switch back to the firstborn son? Would that like give us a permanent? You don't have to do it once because the magical mojo is so high, it would atone for all sins forever. And so it would solve the problem, right? And then if they go, well, what if it's God's son, right? So it's like the most important firstborn son possible. The magical mojo of that sacrifice is going to be the best ever. So obviously it's going to last forever. And so they came up with this idea of, well, what if the firstborn son of God, who was a known angel at the time, this is a pre-Christian Jewish angelology, had a firstborn son of God called the Logos, called the Paraclete, the image of God, God's agent of creation, the high priest of God's celestial temple, called the angel of many names, right? So they actually had, this was an angel already. So they just imagined that this angel took on a mortal body, wore it like a spacesuit so that it could die, and through its death being sacrificed, and it being called and known as the firstborn son of God, this is the greatest sacrifice that you can get. And so it's better than the goats, right? So it lasts forever. And everything I just told you is explicitly spelled out in Hebrews 9. So if you read chapter 9 of Hebrews, it really just lays out this is why the sacrifice of Jesus works. And it's all this magical, superstitious, hocus pocus stuff. It's not penal substitution, right? It's just magic and spirits and things. It's bizarre, primitive, shamanic stuff.
It's substitutionary in that he's dying for our sins, though.
In a sense, yeah, but it's actually through magical effect on substances in the universe, right? So he dies in that sense, but his mortal body therefore kind of represents it's not filled with sins because he's the pure goat, not the sinful goat, not the goat that all the sins are cast into. He's the goat who's slain, and his blood atones for that. But it's not like any kind of system of justice. It's just it calms God down. Right? It assuages God's anger. There is no logical reason for this to do this, because this is a very primitive, shamanic way of seeing the world. Like now we know that makes no sense, but it's like God, like you said, why can't God just forgive? Like why do you have to kill things to calm him down? But no, that's just what they believed. You had to sacrifice something. Something had to be sacrificed, and that's as Hebrews 9 says. Like there is no forgiveness without blood. So for whatever reason, God just absolutely has to have the blood before he'll forgive. And that was just a non-negotiable of their religion. That was just how they understood God to be. As you get to secular enlightened philosophy, we start to realize that is a really stupid way to run a universe, but it is not flattering to God's character that he needs bloodshed to forgive. But it is the way people thought thousands of years ago.
Yeah. It's interesting too, when you think about the different versions. Ehrman makes the one point that if you look at Luke and how Luke's understanding of the cross is different from the others, that what really goes on with Luke and with Acts is that it's Jesus's death that people see as their responsibility for, and so will repent for it. So it's not the crucifixion that's going to be the main event for Luke, but Ehrman says that it's the people seeing the evils in themselves and repent that's going to cause God to forgive them. And but there's so many different, this is the last thing I wanted to ask. There's so many different views and takes out there. Like even if you look at the liberal Christians like James McGrath, he says, well, we're not going to have a substitutionary understanding of the cross in Paul. We're going to have a participation one. So for example, in 2 Corinthians 5:14, where it says that one died for all and therefore all died. Or I have this written down here because I have my memory.
This is the magical mojo thing, right? So the logic within Paul is that, first of all, if you get baptized, that is actually an adoption ceremony. You get adopted as the son of God. And therefore, as a son of God, you share in the inheritance of God's kingdom, just straightforwardly, like any other worldly kingdom, it would be the same way. And so, and then the whole idea is that you're taking the spirit of Jesus within you, so that what Jesus accomplished becomes magically imparted onto you, like physically. Like this is actual physical magic that's essentially happening. You become a part of this thing, and thus you share in the benefits and privileges of Jesus. So that's what you're talking about, I think, with the participatory aspect of it. That is very much definitely in Paul. Like Paul sees it as, if you join this basically octopus spirit of Jesus, you will get swept up because Jesus has done the great sacrifice. If you're a part of Jesus, then you will share, because you are a part of Jesus, you will share in the same benefits, the same glorification that Jesus received, and the same resurrection, and so on. So that's and so baptism was seen as a voluntary death. You're dying to sin, and thus that is your sort of symbolic crucifixion, as it were. And thus you share in the crucifixion of Jesus. Whatever magic Jesus accomplished gets imparted onto you because you're bringing literally, physically, the Spirit of Christ into you. And so, again, it's magical mojo thinking, but it is participatory in that sense. It's participatory in a literal, physical sense, like actual physics, and not in a like conceptual justice sense, if that makes sense. Like that's for Paul and the earliest Christians, it is literally physical magic that's happening here.
What do you make of this? Will be my last one. Sorry. What do you make of Tabor's point when he looks at the Didache and says, "Well, there's nothing here about atoning sacrifice or anything else like that. It's just like that." It seems as though there was a community of early Christians for whom this wasn't even an issue, or like
right. The Didache I take as so late and derivative that I don't use it for, it's not relevant to the origins of Christianity, right? Whatever's in the Didache you can't confidently trace it back to any earlier period. So it's not usable in my sense, or my understanding, for reconstructing the origins of Christianity. Whereas Paul is definitely sitting right there amongst Christians, trying to gain acceptance with fellow leadership of the church and so on. So what you get in Paul is definitely what the earliest version of Christianity is. Any attempts, and this isn't the only one, there are other attempts to try and imagine that there was some other Christianity that was completely different and didn't have the atonement theology, that was coterminous with Paul's Christianity. All of that I find hopelessly speculative. I've never seen any like tangible evidence that can actually confirm that was actually the case. All I see are speculations, reconstructions of ways to interpret the evidence, but no evidence that those reinterpretations are true. So I've never found any convincing evidence of that for early Christianity, which doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just I don't see it, so I can't work with that, right? I can't start with a premise that I can't establish.
All righty. And then I guess
for answering the questions. I appreciate
it. Sure.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a good question, John. All right, so I guess we'll do one more question, and then we'll talk about, I'll let you promote your works, and you can talk about your times with Internet Infidels. So for our last question for today, do you think that mythicism will ever become mainstream in academia in the future?
Yeah, I think it will have at least the level of respectability that other theses do. Like, for example, the zealot hypothesis is a good example where I don't find that plausible, but it is accepted as at least as not the most probable, but as at least a plausible reconstruction of Jesus, that he was originally a violent military guy, and they got whitewashed after his death into a pacifist, right? That's Fernando Bermejo Rubio is like probably one of the leading proponents of that view today. So there are actual scholars in the field who promote these kind of fringe theories of historicity. I think mythicism is going to eventually get to the point where it's going to be as accepted among them, at least as at least plausible. We've already got 20. Or 19 or 20. I can't remember the last count, but I've been accumulating examples of scholars who've come out admitting that the historicity is doubtable. Even if they themselves are pro-historicity, they say it's at least plausible to reconstruct this. The challenge that historicity is not outrageous. Like they'll at least admit that it's a plausible thing and could be true, even if they conclude that it isn't the most probable explanation. And then we have scholars who are outright agnostic about historicity as well. And these are bona fide scholars with PhDs in the field. Some of them with sitting professors, emeritus professors, and so on. And I have that full list if you go to my blog at richardcarrier.info and just do the search engine, look for Ehrman Recap, and that article recaps 31 points of disagreement between Bart Ehrman and I and how they played out. But item 22 is this one, where he says no scholars agree with this, and it's like, actually there are at least 20 now. So that argument doesn't hold water. But it's been growing. It started around like 4, then went to like 6, then to 10, then to 12, and now we're all the way up to 20. And it's only been, what, like 7 years, 6 or 7 years since my book came out. So if the trend continues, I think especially what you're going to see is younger generations of scholars are going to find it more plausible than older generation. It's the same Thomas Kuhn paradigm.
No, he's frozen.
Oh.
In their ways, like they just can't accept the breath. Oh no, where did I freeze? Am I back?
Yeah. We kind of got that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we got it. Yep.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Right.
I didn't notice it on this end, but check my video's working. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes we get a little bit of bad reception sometimes, but most of the time it's good. So yeah, we got that going for us today. Alrighty. So that concludes the questions. Thank you, sir, for answering all those questions. Those are very good answers.
Yeah.
And then, and thank you, John. That was a good question to ask Carrier. So I guess we'll conclude with telling people how they can get in touch with you. I know you have richardcarrier.info, but you can mention some other places that they can get in touch with you, and then you can promote any works you like, and then you can talk about Internet Infidels.
Yeah. So, ironically, I think my top 2 books are my first and my last so far, right? Sense and Goodness Without God is still, no one has done anything like this, where you take a complete worldview without God. Like, so it's not just, there's a section on what we don't believe, but most of the book is in what we should believe. It's actually positive belief building about, like, what is an atheist worldview? What does it look like if you make it the most evidence-based, science-based point of view? And I cover everything, epistemology, metaphysics, politics, aesthetics, like theory of art and beauty, and obviously ethics and other things. So all of that's in there. And so even if you don't agree with what's in the book, it at least shows you a model for how to build out your own worldview, like what it would take and what you would tinker with and stuff. So I find that book very valuable, and I find a lot of people find it more valuable than they expected. So I always recommend that book, and it holds up pretty well. I have a typos page on my blog, a Sense and Goodness typos page, that has a previous section about the things that substantial things I would change in the book, but they're not a lot. But if you want to know, like, where have my views changed since 2005, that article will tell you, and it's not a lot of things, but there are some things. And then Jesus from Outer Space, which we talked about, which I'm really happy with. It's a good, short, fun read, and it really cuts to the point of dealing with what issues people have that make them resistant to the idea. And I really like, let's break this down and let's look at the evidence and examples and stuff. So I really like that book, and definitely I'm promoting that book the most lately. But the only one, I also want to promote my science stuff. So Ancient Science, I've done The Scientist in the early Roman Empire and Science Education in the early Roman Empire, which actually is about the whole education system. So people who are interested in that, like what was ancient education like, that explains so many things. Like the Bible authors all took the same education. So they went to the same schools, took the same classes, basically, right? So if you want to understand who these authors are like, what kind of school background they had, and what that meant, you got to read this book because it covers the whole aspect of it. It has a focus on the science content, but it covers the whole thing. And then The Scientist in the early Roman Empire covers every aspect of, like, progress, attitudes, who these people were, what they did, and so forth under the Roman Empire. So if you really want to get into ancient science, I still recommend those books, because I'm most proud of that, because that was my dissertation at Columbia University, was on that. And so for people who want to get in touch, want to buy these books, I get a commission if you buy through my website, if you buy through Amazon on my website, and I have recommendations. So you can go to my website, and up top you see recommendations. I have recommendations in philosophy, if you want to get into philosophy, origins of Christianity, and ancient science. So if you buy through my site, I get a commission on that. So I recommend people do that. And this is all at richardcarrier.info. So you can get from there. My Twitter feed has a link. My Facebook feed has a link. And for people who want to know, I have an article there about a guide to my social media. So on my blog, search for Guide to My Social Media, and it explains how I use each item, and so therefore you could figure out which thing you want to, like, follow the most, right, depending on what kinds of things that you want to get out of my work. And then my blog, of course, is there at the website. My Patreon link is through there. Different ways to help I talk about, and my classes. So every month I teach online course, a simple 1-month course in 10 subjects in history and philosophy. So you go to my go to my website. One of the top links there is classes. Just go in there and explore and see if any of those might interest you. And that gives you a chance to like pick my brain for a whole month and get like detailed, concentrated answers on whatever questions you have on whichever subject, right? And then I have recommended readings, and so I have like guidance questions to like help you try to like think about the subject and challenge yourself and so on. So for people who want to take those courses, you can get that through my website as well. So really everything is channeled through richardcarrier.info, and that's the place to go.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
I really appreciate getting to meet you. I'm kind of fanboy geeking out right now because I followed your work for many years, and definitely if people haven't read On the Historicity of Jesus yet, do read it. It's completely accessible, and I learned a great deal from it.
Yeah, for people who don't know it, even if you don't agree with the thesis, the book is full of interesting information that will change the way you see the origins of Christianity. So, and it's not even stuff that's controversial. It's just stuff that's not taught generally. The average person doesn't know these things. So it is a valuable book, even if you're not in favor of the thesis. So I recommend it for that reason as well. But I want to thank you guys for carrying on the legacy, keeping Secular Web alive and working on getting it a new face, right?
I know. Yeah, because I came up with our first idea of making a YouTube channel and like a podcast. And then John McDonald came up with the idea of making a kids site called Secular Web Kids. It's looking really good. Him and Ray W. Johnson, who's our leader, is helping us out too. So
yeah. No, I'm so glad to see that happening.
Today was Bring Your Bible to School Day for around 500,000 kids. So if you're,
I didn't know that was a thing, man. Okay.
Yeah. So if you want an alternative, come to Secular Web Kids and we'll hook you up.
Awesome. And then just to close out, we'll let you talk about your good old times with Internet Infidels if you want to.
You keep mentioning it. I'm like, gosh, what would I talk about? I don't know.
The good old times. I was like, I'll give you something. You can just mention something in passing. Give us some.
Give us
your best memory back in the day.
My best memory was having our board meeting in Oregon. I think it was Oregon. And we got to like tour some like local sites, like there's a waterfall and stuff to see, and we just basically got to hang out together while also doing the board meeting, for two days basically of discussions and ideas, and just getting to meet and powwow with people and like get business done and stuff, and hang out with everybody after business was concluded. With that was probably like the best experience and the thing that I looked forward to the most when I was working for Secular Web.
Sweet. Alrighty, guys. Well, thank you all for coming here, and that was a very good interview. And thank you again, Dr. Carrier, for making time out of your schedule. And then after this, I close this. You'll have this video in about an hour. It'll take about an hour for it to get processed, and you'll have the YouTube link by today. So
cool, excellent.
Yeah,
very good.
All right, thank you all, guys, and thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for some more good episodes coming soon. Alrighty.